There is a specific feeling that arrives before a salary negotiation. It settles in before the conversation starts, before anyone has said anything. It is not excitement. It is not strategy. It lives closer to what you might call readiness to be judged, a low-grade alertness, a sensing of stakes that feel disproportionate to what the conversation is supposed to be. You prepared the number. You rehearsed the reasoning. You told yourself the data would carry it. And then, the moment you say it out loud, something happens that preparation does not prevent. The exchange stops feeling like a transaction. It starts feeling like a verdict on you. That feeling has a name. It is not nerves. It is not imposter syndrome. It is a structural condition, one that was engineered into the conversation before you arrived, by people who understood something most employees do not. The salary was never just a number. It was designed to feel like a reflection of your worth. And once that design is in place, any negotiation over the number becomes, almost automatically, a negotiation over the person. The conventional explanation for why salary negotiation feels personal is that it is a confidence problem. The framework is consistent across most professional advice. Know your market value, come prepared with data, make the first offer anchor high. The underlying assumption is that negotiation is an information and psychology problem. People who are good at it have data and confidence. People who are not lack one or both. Fix the preparation, fix the mindset, close the gap. This framework is not entirely wrong. Data does help. Confidence does shift outcomes. But the framework rests on a premise that does not hold that salary negotiation is a standard negotiation, structurally similar to pricing a freelance project or settling a contractor's fee. It assumes the discomfort people feel is generic negotiation anxiety, the kind that practice can fix. That is the part that needs examination. Most people who have walked into a salary conversation with research, competing offers, and rehearsed language know that the data does not dissolve the feeling. You can enter the room with salary surveys, a written competing offer, and a well-constructed case and still feel the moment the conversation shifts. A tightening, an instinct to justify the number before they have had a chance to respond. A small, unreasonable urge to explain yourself more than the situation requires. The data gives you something to say. It does not explain why the room feels heavier than the information inside it should justify. The cultural story around this experience is sympathetic. It names it imposter syndrome. It calls it a confidence gap. It prescribes believing in your worth, owning the conversation, reframing the ask. The prescription is directed entirely at the individual. Think differently, stand differently, internalize your market value. As if the architecture of the room is neutral, and only the person who walks into it needs adjusting. That architecture is not neutral. It was built. And before we name the mechanism behind it, it is worth understanding what the architecture actually accomplishes, because the outcome it produces has very specific beneficiaries. Consider the physiology of the moment before the number is said out loud. Heart rate increases. Cortisol is present. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for language, planning, and long-term calculation, is slightly impaired by the stress response. Psychologists call this underlying condition evaluation apprehension, the specific anxiety produced by knowing your performance is being assessed and that the assessment carries consequences. It is the same state produced by a job interview, a high-stakes presentation, a conversation with someone whose opinion of you feels like a verdict you cannot appeal. It is not, notably, the state produced by most other negotiations. People negotiate prices on furniture without trembling. They push back on contractor quotes without rehearsing for days. They decline offers on used cars without their voices tightening. The mechanics of those conversations are identical to a salaries discussion, a buyer, a seller, a price in dispute, information asymmetry on both sides. But the experience is not identical. And the explanation that locates the difference inside the individual confidence, self-worth, cultural conditioning, does not fully account for why the discomfort is so consistently specific to salary, so consistently triggered in people who are otherwise capable negotiators in every other context. Here is the crack in the comfortable story. If salary negotiation discomfort were purely a confidence problem, we would expect it to diminish reliably with practice. More negotiations, more exposure, less friction. That is not what the evidence shows. People who have negotiated salaries many times, people with wins on record, with competing offers, with carefully constructed cases, still report the same specific friction, not generic performance anxiety, something more precisely targeted. A sensation that the conversation is reaching past the professional and touching something more fundamental, something that does not feel like it should be subject to negotiation at all. That sensation is a symptom, and it is pointing at a design decision that is rarely identified as such, because identifying it is not in the interest of the organization where the design lives. The mechanism has a functional name: salary identity fusion. It is not an accident of corporate culture. It is not an unintended consequence of how compensation systems evolved. It is a structural condition that benefits organizations with high retention goals, and it developed over decades through the deliberate layering of specific tools, performance reviews, compensation language, internal equity frameworks, all of which share a single architectural feature. They anchor an employee's sense of their own worth to the organization's evaluation of them. Begin with the performance review. The annual performance review exists, in most organizations, as the formal moment when compensation is connected to judgment. The format varies: ratings, competency matrices, development feedback, but the structural function is consistent. Your performance is assessed. A number is assigned. Salary is adjusted in proportion to that number. And in most implementations, the adjustment is called recognition, not a market correction, not a competitive adjustment. Recognition. The word is not accidental. Recognition implies that the number is confirming something true about you, that the organization has formally seen your value and is now reflecting it back in the form of a figure. Recognition is what you give to someone whose worth you are formally acknowledging. And every year, the salary conversation is framed not as a market transaction, but as a personal verdict delivered by someone with authority over your future. After 12 or 15 years of that framing, the salary and the verdict become the same object in the employee's mind. The second layer is the language of internal equity. When employees enter compensation discussions during a raise request or an offer negotiation, they are frequently presented with the concept of internal equity. What other employees at similar levels are currently earning inside the same organizations? This framing moves the reference point from the external market to the inside of the building. It is a deliberate structural choice. The external market would reveal whether the organization is paying at, above, or below the going rate, information that gives the employee negotiating leverage. The internal equity reference keeps the comparison local, controlled, and bounded. It also performs a secondary function. By tying your number to other people's numbers inside the same building, it creates the impression that your salary is part of a coherent fairness architecture, a system rather than a negotiated market price that reflects whoever pushed hardest. The framing sounds principled. For the organization, it is. The third layer is the most subtle. It is the consistent organizational behavior of framing salary negotiations as relational ones. The phrases are recognizable. We really value you here. I want to see what I can do for you. You are one of our strongest performers. I will go to bat for you. These phrases are not dishonest in isolation, but they perform a function. They transform the negotiation from a market transaction into a relationship dynamic. They make acceptance feel like loyalty and departure feel like something closer to betrayal. They reframe the conversation from what your skills command in the market to what you mean to the people around you. And once that reframe is in place, a lower number is no longer a commercial outcome. It becomes an expression of how much they care. And accepting it feels like an act of relationship rather than a concession. Here is the point that matters most in everything you have just heard. If your salary were simply a price, like any other price, you would negotiate it the way you negotiate any other price. You would walk away from offers below your floor without guilt, You would not feel that asking for more is a test of your self-belief. You would not feel exposed when the number comes back lower than you asked. The fact that it does not feel like any other price is not a personality trait. It is evidence that the mechanism has worked. The origins of this structure are worth briefly tracing. The modern performance review system, developed through the mid-20th century as organizations, scaled beyond the point where managers could know every employee personally. Formal evaluation systems were designed partly to create consistency and to defend against discrimination, claims to make compensation decisions defensible by tying them to documented assessments. That is a legitimate and originally protective function. But over time, the evaluation system absorbed something it was never formally assigned: the role of telling employees what they were worth as people. The language evolved gradually. Performance became value to the organization. Salary adjustment became recognition. Market rate became what we are able to offer at your level. Each shift was incremental. Cumulatively, they constructed an architecture in which compensation and self-worth became inseparable in the minds of the people receiving both. Who profits from salary identity fusion? The organization does, in two ways that translate directly to the balance sheet. First, employees whose salary is experienced as recognition rather than market rate are significantly less likely to leave when competing offers arrive. According to Gallup research, replacing a manager or senior professional costs between 80 and 200% of their annual salary, encompassing recruiting, onboarding, lost institutional knowledge, and the productivity gap during transition. An employee whose identity is fused with their salary is measurably cheaper to retain. Second, employees who experience salary as a verdict are less likely to negotiate assertively, because assertive negotiation requires temporarily separating the number from the treating yourself as a market asset with a floor price rather than a person seeking acknowledgement. For an employee in whom identity fusion is strong, that separation does not feel strategic. It feels dangerous, and they settle for a number below what the external market would pay. The mechanism generates retention. It generates compensation below market rate for the employee, and it costs the organization nothing to maintain because the maintenance happens entirely inside the employee. Owen is 41. He has worked in marketing for 16 years, the last 7 at the same company, rising from senior manager to director of brand. His base salary is $147,000. He considers himself financially literate, capable of rational decision-making, and not especially sentimental about professional compensation. He is, by most measures, the last person who should be surprised by what happens to him in a salary negotiation. Owen is an illustrative construction. The mechanism is real. In March, Owen receives unsolicited outreach from a recruiting firm. The role is similar to his current position, director of brand marketing at a mid-sized software company, and the salary range offered is $172,000 to $188,000. He is not looking to leave. He goes through the process partly out of curiosity and partly because, as he tells a colleague, he wants to know what he is worth out there. He is offered the role at $176,000. Owen takes the competing offer to employer. He has documented performance. He has a written offer letter. He has 7 years of institutional knowledge and a direct report team. By any market analysis, he is in a strong negotiating position. His manager's response is immediate and warm. "You are one of the most important people on this team. I do not want to lose you. Let me go to HR and see what I can do." The phrase "see what I can do" is not a commitment. Owen registers this. The warmth surrounding it, however, is real, and he interprets the warmth as a signal of the outcome. HR comes back with $159,000. The gap between that number and the competing offer is $17,000 per year. Owen's response to the counteroffer is not what he expected of himself. He does not feel disappointed. He feels something closer to gratitude, a sense that they tried, that the number represents effort made on his behalf, that the people around him genuinely went to work for him. He accepts. He does not revisit this decision for 8 months. 8 months later, at an industry dinner, a former colleague describes going through an almost identical sequence: competing offer, counteroffer conversation, significant gap, and simply leaving. Taking the external role at the higher number. The former colleague describes the decision as entirely commercial. It was just a price, they say. I did not have a lot of feelings about it. Owen sits with that sentence for a long time afterward. He had many feelings about it. He felt grateful. He felt seen. He felt, specifically, that $159,000 was evidence that he was valued, and that walking away from it would have been a rejection of that valuation, a statement about the relationship he was not willing to make. He begins to reconstruct what actually happened. The $159,000 was not the market price for his skills. It was the number his employer calculated as the minimum required to retain him, calibrated against his perceived reluctance to leave, not against the full value he would generate in the role. The warmth in the room was genuine, but warmth and fair market compensation are different calculations, and he had allowed one to function as his assessment of the other. The competing offer, $176,000, was the reference point he brought into the room. It was not the reference point from which he made the decision. The reference point he actually used was the internal number he had absorbed over 7 years of annual reviews and incremental recognition, a number calibrated by people with a retention goal. The external offer told him what the market thought. The 7 years told him what he was worth in that building. And the 7 years won. This is what salary identity fusion looks like in practice. Not a dramatic failure, a perfectly rational feeling decision made from a corrupted reference point that cost the person making it $17,000 per year, and a corresponding reduction in every financial output attached to that number for as long as the anchor holds. Scale this mechanism across an industry, and the pattern becomes structural rather than individual. The question is not whether Owen made a suboptimal decision. The question is how many employees in how many organizations are making equivalent decisions for the same reason at the same annual cost, and who benefits from the consistency of that outcome. Research on voluntary turnover consistently identifies feeling undervalued and not being paid what I am worth as primary drivers of departure. The language matters. Employees do not typically report leaving because they are being paid below market rate. They report leaving because they do not feel valued. The subjective framing is the mechanism at work. Compensation is experienced through the lens of recognition, and recognition is delivered by the organization. When employees perceive recognition as insufficient, the departure is interpreted as an emotional event rather than a commercial calculation. The solution becomes one of management, culture, and belonging, not pricing. Organizations have understood this at a structural level for decades. The discipline of total rewards the formal framework used by compensation professionals to design and communicate pay structures explicitly incorporate performance and recognition as a component of the compensation experience, alongside base pay and benefits. The World at Work total rewards model, which has functioned as the dominant HR compensation framework since the early 2000s, defines total rewards not merely as the amount paid but as the totality of value exchanged between employer and employee, an experience, not a figure. The goal of total rewards design is not to maximize employee compensation. It is to maximize the perceived value of the package relative to its cost to the organization. Salary identity fusion is not an accidental byproduct of this framework. It is among its most reliable mechanisms. The internal equity framing deserves specific attention at scale. When employees are told their salary must account for internal equity, how the figure compares to peers at the same level inside the organization, the external market is removed from the negotiation entirely. The reference point is redirected from what this skill set earns externally to what people in similar roles earn in this building. The range is bounded by what the organization has already decided to pay. The employee, offered a framework that sounds principled and fair, often accepts the outcome as a function of a system rather than a negotiation they could have approached differently. The annual review cycle reinforces this architecture at scale. Reviews happen once a year. Salary conversations are attached to reviews. The timing is not neutral. It creates a single annual window in which employees are formally permitted to address compensation, and that window is structurally linked to a performance evaluation, just delivered by the same person who controls the salary decision. The embedded message is consistent, even when unspoken. Your compensation is a function of their judgment of you, not your assessment of what the market would pay. The sequencing trains employees to present themselves as deserving rather than to price themselves as scarce. The former is a significantly weaker negotiating position. The cumulative cost to the individual is substantial. A professional who accepts below-market compensation at one negotiation and remains in place for 7 to 10 years without resetting to external market rate loses, conservatively, between $150,000 and $300,000 in foregone earnings before accounting for the compounding effect on retirement contributions, the anchoring effect on future negotiations at subsequent employers, and the opportunity cost of operating inside a system experienced as evaluative rather than transactional. That cost is not shared. It is paid entirely by the employee. The organization retains the difference. A salary is a price. It is a number that a buyer and a seller negotiate over a specific asset: your labor, your expertise, your institutional knowledge, your availability in the market. Like any other price, it is shaped by supply and demand, by relative bargaining power, by the quality of alternatives available to both parties, and by who controls the information in the room. The negotiation over that number is, structurally, no different from any other price negotiation, except that it does not feel that way. And the reason it does not feel that way is that the system in place is specifically designed to prevent it from feeling that way. Because the moment it feels like a price, just a price, not a judgment, not a recognition, not a statement about your worth, the employee's behavior in the room changes completely. A price can come in low without that telling you anything about who you are. A price reflects what this buyer is currently willing to pay in this transaction at this point in time. A contractor whose quote is declined does not conclude they have overvalued their skills. They move to the next client. Rejection tells them something about the buyer's budget and circumstances, not about the quality of their work. The phrases that make retention negotiations feel warm: "We value you here. I will go to bat for you. We do not want to lose you," are genuine expressions of a working relationship. They are also negotiating positions. Both things are simultaneously true. A transaction does not require warmth to be fair, and warmth does not constitute fair compensation. Conflating the two is not a failure of intelligence. It is a predictable response to an architecture built to produce exactly that conflation. The most effective negotiators, the ones whose outcomes research consistently identifies as different, are not notably more confident than average. They are notably less emotionally activated by the number that comes back across the table. They are not indifferent to their work or their colleagues. They are detached from the verdict. The number is a number. If it meets their assessed floor, they consider it. If it does not, they return to the table or they leave. The conversation does not reach the part of them that is an identity. That detachment is not innate. It is the consequence of understanding where the attachment came from and who it serves. What happened in that negotiation room was not a failure to know your worth. It was the room performing the function it was designed for, presenting a price as a judgment and allowing the judgment to occupy the space where the price should have landed. The discomfort you felt was the mechanism working correctly. The number that emerged was not the market number. It was the number produced by a system in which your sense of your own value had been quietly, gradually, and deliberately anchored to the organization's evaluation of you over years. The price is the price. What it says about who you are is a different document entirely, and that document was written by someone with a retention budget. The number was never a verdict on you. It was a retention calculation made by someone with a budget and a timeline. The distance between those two things, between what the number meant to you and what it meant to them, is what you left on the table. When did you first notice that a salary number felt like more than just a number? Drop that moment in the comments. Identity fusion with income is one of the most effective retention tools ever designed, and it costs you more than just a negotiation. That is where the next episode begins.